Thanks a lot, Minister. You're obviously responsible for, and it's not your fault, but the #1 emitting sector of the economy in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. You have the lowest percentage reduction target to 20.
Sorry, Deputy Murphy, apologies for interrupting you. I have received a message from Deputy O'Rourke who needs to go. Do you want to come in, Deputy O'Rourke, now, or you're a bit tight on time?
If we'll be here at 1:15, I'm happy to come back. I think we will be. Will we?
We can be if Deputy Murphy has lots of questions.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Deputy Murphy.
We can go back and forth between me and you if you want. So, #1 emitting sector, smallest target, percentage terms, but obviously has a huge impact on whether we achieve our overall 51% reduction or not. You've already used in the sector 44% of the emission ceiling in the first 2 years for the first carbon budget period. Do you accept that, like, as things currently stand, you're very significantly off track meeting the 25% reduction target?
I think we've ground to make up, and I think we're not any different to every other sector, and indeed some sectors are further behind than where we are, but we're making progress, but we have ground to make up, Deputy Murphy, yeah.
And are you saying that in what you've outlined to us in your opening statement, that will be enough to make up that ground?
I think it potentially can be. It's a big ask to make it up in the short term, but there is the capacity there that the measures we're putting in place will build momentum, and I think it is something we're going to see, particularly in agriculture, where that momentum has to be built up. And it's good to see the work that is ongoing and that farmers have been doing actually start to show real results with the reduction of emissions last year. And for example, if you look at the very significant change of approaches and farming practice at farm level in relation to using chemical fertiliser, the progress farmers have made in that, for example, in the last couple of years. Last year, chemical fertiliser usage was down by 14%. This year, it's on usage. On top of that, it's on course to be down around approximately 15% again, and around that. So that's very significant, rapid progress, and that's something we need to work on. And you know, there's a lot of good work going on.
And do you think that we can meet the target of 25% reduction without a reduction in the total volume of meat and dairy products produced?
Yeah, I mean, the Teagasc MAC curve and the assessments in relation to the measures that we have in place and that has been worked on are showing that can be achieved. It's going to take a hell of an effort, but it can be done.
Is there any limit to how many dairy cows you think we should have in this country, and do you think that is compatible with reaching the climate targets?
Well, I think we had a situation whereby, quite unusually in economic terms, we had a dairy sector which was subject to quotas for about 30 years, which was constrained, and that led to a distortion in relation to the balance between the different sectors in agriculture, because dairying was one sector which couldn't expand. We saw expansion in the dairy herd then following the removal of quotas at European level. There's been a stabilisation now, and indeed small net reductions the last year or two in relation to the annual cattle herd. So I think that's found its level, and the objective is to put the focus on reducing the emissions in terms of that herd that we have.
I mean, I think you're wrong that it will be achievable. The 25% reduction, which I think itself is inadequate, but a 25% reduction will be achievable without reducing the total volume of meat and dairy production. Just in relation to that, could I ask your opinion on the so-called Dublin Declaration, which basically suggested that production of meat and so on can be a positive for the environment?
Well, I mean, the production of meat and dairy is very positive in terms of actually feeding people. And the key thing in terms of how we do that is continuing with that work, Deputy Murphy, and taking every step we can then in terms of reducing the emissions footprint of it. It is something which we have been doing as a country for a long time, and is being a staple part of diets in many other parts of the world. Our herd, for example, size now is just 4% higher than what it would have been 50 years ago, and here domestically. So it's something we certainly should keep doing, and it's a really important activity.
Do you think that meat is beneficial to the environment, the production of meat?
I think it's really important. Well, I think it's how you do it, and it's about doing it sustainably, and it can be done very sustainably.
What the Dublin Declaration claimed is that it was beneficial to the environment, the production of meat. It's not clear whether you're saying to me, no, it's not, but it's important for food production, and therefore we have to take a hit on the environment, or whether you are endorsing the claim that meat production is beneficial for the environment.
I think meat production and dairy production and grain production, all of that can be done in a way that is sustainable and in sync with the environment around it as part of a sustainable food system.
And do you think it was appropriate for public money through Teagasc to be used to host this conference, which resulted in the Dublin Declaration? 45,000 euros of public money was spent on what was effectively an exercise in climate denial.
Well, I disagree with what you're saying there, but I absolutely agree that it was appropriate for Teagasc to lead out, as they do, in terms of the research they're doing and in terms of the very sustainable food system we have.
You don't see any parallel between what the meat industry, which was behind that Dublin Declaration, was doing there and the climate denialism of the fossil fuel industry?
Anything Teagasc is involved in, Deputy Murphy put their name to, they look at it with very strong scientific rigour, and I fully back the work that they're doing.
I mean, I just then don't take seriously your claim that you're serious about reducing emissions by 25% when you're endorsing public money being spent on a climate denialist exercise. I mean, do you accept that it was the meat industry that was behind the Dublin Declaration?
I don't agree it was a climate denialist exercise, Deputy Murphy. I think Teagasc organised that conference. All the work that Teagasc do is very robust. Anything they attach their name to is backed up in terms of the scientific work that they do. And I think in terms of our meat production or dairy production or grain production, that all has to be part of a sustainable food system. We have a very strong sustainable food system here at the moment, which we have to make even more sustainable, particularly in relation to seeking to reduce the emissions footprint of how we produce that food.
Okay. A bit taken aback that you didn't at least distance yourself from what was the climate. Anyway, moving on. Do you accept that there's new research that suggests that the potential for soil carbon sequestration on grasslands is lower, much lower and uncertain at best compared to previous research? And will you ensure that no carbon farming scheme is permitted to operate in Ireland on the basis of out-of-date scientific information?
The way that it's measured and the science around how we do any carbon sequestration in soils has to be robustly backed up. We're putting a lot of investment at the moment. I outlined in my opening statement the work that Teagasc is carrying out in relation to the 30 flux towers that are around the country, doing ongoing current research in relation to this. And also I've established a soil carbon observatory as well and funded that for Teagasc as well, which their key role is to keep learning and keep updating and keep having the most recent science and indeed breaking new ground in relation to science around this. And then on the back of that, it's important then that we find ways of actually monetising that and providing income streams for farmers in relation to carbon sequestration.
You're aware, presumably, of recent figures from your department which suggested that the emissions from peatland forestry were underestimated, and as a consequence, Irish forests are set to become a source of carbon rather than a carbon sink for the next 26 years until 2050 because they were planted on peatlands. How do you respond to that? Do you accept that there's been a real problem in terms of Ireland's plantation forestry policy? And what guidance will you give to landowners with forestry on drained peatlands?
So listen, I mean, like with everything else, in terms of how we live our everyday lives, there's been constant and evolving knowledge and research in relation to the impact of anything we do in relation to the environment. We do have a challenge now in the next number of years from an emissions point of view in relation to the age profile of our national forests, because there was very, very significant afforestation in the 80s and 90s in particular, and as trees grow, then and particularly whenever they get into the second half, the middle part and the second part of their lifespan, they acquire and sequester carbon in a much faster way than they do whenever they're small saplings. But what we're seeing now is in relation to the harvesting. Some of our more mature forests are being harvested. Obviously, in relation to they then get replanted. There's a legal obligation to replant them, but there's less sequestration from the new saplings at that stage of their life than there is from larger trees previous to them being forested. Also then in the past there would have been more forestry grown and planted in peatlands. The research and understanding around that has changed significantly in relation to the potential for that to actually release carbon. So our new forestry programme has very different rules now in relation to where forests can be planted, particularly preventing them being planted on peatland. And then in relation to how we manage forests that actually are harvested, that were previously on peatlands, that's something that we're continuing to research and work with our forest services and our research agencies as to how we best approach those particular sites.
To return to the original point I was discussing with you about emissions being agricultural emissions being correlated with total volume of meat and dairy output, and you argued that no, we can at least maintain the same size of meat and dairy output or even increase and yet still achieve our targets. Let's hope you're right, if that's the policy you're going to go on, but let's say you're wrong, and let's say you're nowhere near achieving the 25% reduction target in 2026, 27, 28. At what point will you look at that again and then say, okay, we need to reduce total?
Well, I think it's something we have to continually look at year on year, and that's why the Climate Action Plan and the annual plans that each department has to put together and each minister has to put together are reviewed and looked at and updated annually. That's why we have this process as well in terms of engagement and accountability. So I think it's something we have to look at on an ongoing basis, Deputy Murphy. But things are evolving rapidly. Like, I've just given the example of feed additives earlier. When you look at our agricultural emissions profile, about 1/3 of our agricultural emissions is related to nitrous oxide and CO2, mostly nitrous oxide, that third. A small proportion of it is CO2 from machinery use, for example. But most of that 1/3 is nitrous oxide, which is related to chemical fertilizers. And in relation to that, over the last 2 years, we've seen a 30% reduction in the use of chemical fertilizers, which is phenomenal progress and achievement. The other 2/3 of emissions then from agriculture relates to methane, which is obviously livestock direct from livestock. But then you look at what's happening in terms of the research around feed additives, and how our own domestic research is showing that you can have up to at house systems you can have a 30% reduction in methane with the exact same number of animals. That's really, really significant there. And also in terms of how that research is looking to be applied to pastoral systems, that's something that's been looked at too. So there's a lot of attention and research going into what additional steps we could take. We're also partnering strongly with New Zealand, for example, which is most similar to ourselves internationally in relation to being a grass-based grazing production system, and jointly investing in research projects there. So we have to look at that and continue to monitor it, and we should be doing that on a year-to-year basis.